Okay, if you haven't read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, you gotta run off and read it. It's a very short read, and the comrades and I, we've been reading it in the past few weeks. It doesn't really take much time to read. You can read it in an hour or so, but we've been really digging into all the details, and it is an amazing, amazing read. It reads like a report on the news on some occasions. It just reads very, very contemporary, because Lenin was observing the phenomena that were happening at the beginning of the 20th century, and they continued happening. Those trends continued happening in the capitalist world, and we still have empires, and they're not going away anytime soon. But what I do want to address in today's video is this one little bit, the argument between Lenin and Kautsky, which kind of is an infamous argument. Of course, many other people had arguments with Kautsky, and I think Kautsky may have been pronounced revisionist or what have you, but this argument in particular is something that we are kind of seeing today. We're seeing a lot of people go down the same kind of a thought process as Kautsky did way back when. And this is the belief in ultra-imperialism. So Kautsky had this belief that because imperialism is the stage when monopolies are ruling over everything, basically when the financial capital appears, when bank capital and the productive capital fuse together and become financial capital, so they're able to generate money. Money is able to generate money. If you remember this Marxist little formula, which goes as money, commodity, money, apostrophe, I don't know how you guys call it. We call it shtrich. I don't remember how you guys call this particular thing, but basically the financial capital is what can generate money out of nothing, right? When the banks start loaning money to businesses, then they get their revenue or whatever they call it, the interest, whatever, and it's basically making money out of thin air. Lenin explains it very well in this work, so go on and just read it, because I'm not going to try and explain it because I've read it in Russian, so I don't want to translate it. I will put the link down below in English. But nonetheless, the argument that Kautsky had was that because the tendency of monopolization happens under imperialism, and this is basically how empires grow, because more and more resources and assets and political power is now in the hands of a few organizations, they're able to really create the routes for the future of this country, the future of this region, because they get to decide how to spend the money. And we are observing this right now with the United States. And you can come up with a ton of examples, I'm sure. But I digress. So going back to Kautsky's argument, so he believed that the ultra-imperialism is going to encompass all of the businesses, all of the enterprises, all of the productive forces under one entity. And this is when there's going to be no more conflict, no more wars, because this one single monopoly, world monopoly, is not going to be interested in destroying its own assets, in destroying its own labor power, etc. And Lenin points out very well how this is wrong. This is a wrong type of thinking, because not only is it idealist and kind of extrapolates data, but also it is because the historical analysis shows very clearly that this has not happened. And Lenin provides a ton of examples of how Europe was fighting amongst each other. Even if it wasn't active warfare, there were still fighting against each other tooth and nail for power, for resources, for assets at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. And he gives an example of the United States also beginning to participate in this race to the top, supposedly, but it's actually a race to the bottom. And if you follow Lenin's logic, it becomes very clear that monopolies, they bear the antitheses of themselves. Within themselves, because they are not born in a vacuum, right? Monopolies do not just appear out of nothing. They arise out of the economic circumstances. And Lenin shows us this route, this way the monopolies consolidate more and more power and resources and assets, etc., etc., and of course more money. And this way, it is also creating other powers that are going to be able to oppose the said growing monopoly. And he gives a ton of examples of how it happened in England, on how it happened in France, in Germany, how all of these European powers at the beginning of the 20th century were trying to divide the world amongst themselves. And the division was supposedly over by the 1920s or so. But we see now it is still not over because, of course, of the creation of the Soviet Union, because of the rise of China. The division of the world has never ended, and it continues to this day. But at that time period, even when the world was seemingly divided, there were new powers arising continuously. Because imagine that if you provide a country with some resources because you want to extract something from them. And it actually is exactly what happened to China. The United States in the latter part of the 20th century was pumping resources into China because they wanted all that cheap labor that was available at the time and no longer available, by the way. And it was just pumping so much technology into the Chinese sector because they wanted to exploit all of the people and all of the resources that China possessed. And in the end, what it led to is that China was taking notes. It was using those resources, those technologies, at first to maybe copy some of the things, but then it really learned the methods. And now China is able to create so many things on its own without the help of the United States, without the help from Europe. So the United States empire created its own antithesis in the process of trying to actually consolidate all of the power. And the same thing happened at the beginning of the 20th century when all of these with the ring European empires were still struggling to divide the world. They were still pumping out resources out of the underdeveloped nations, the nations that they underdeveloped, they did not allow to develop. And at the same time, they were still building railroads because they needed the resources to be shipped from point A to point B. They were still somewhat investing into infrastructure, but they never did that for the good of the people. They always did that so they could extract the resources as efficiently and as quickly as possible. But they did that nonetheless. And because of the connection to the imperial core, those countries picking up all those crumbs of some useful education, of some useful technology, many of these countries started to arise as the opposition to the empire's core. So the empire is never going to be able to consolidate all of the power because there are always going to be new powers that arise as a response and not necessarily as a reaction, but more so that the empire, again, does not exist in a vacuum. Though they need other people's, other lands, resources, other people's cheap labor. So they're going to be pumping, investing the resources into some sectors, and without them even realizing that, unbeknownst to them, those places are going to learn. They're going to learn and they're going to also have their own agendas and pursue those agendas. So they will become rival powers to the other empires. And whether it's going to lead to continuous fighting or not, that is not really the point of this work. But Kautsky's argument that the ultra-imperialism ultimately is going to lead to this one single worldwide monopoly, and that's going to stop all the wars. That was a very naive, very idealist type of conclusion, which Lenin ultimately accused of being pacifying and kind of social democratic in the modern terms type of an argument, a reformist argument, improvement, if you will, because what it does, it creates an illusion in the working people's minds that you can do some kind of concessions within capitalism. You can pursue various incremental improvements to capitalism and just wait for the older system to die out on its own, which is like the evolution type of a theory, which has been proven to be false because it's just not happening. Capitalism is going to destroy everything it touches just because the only goal for capitalism is profit, and when it seeks profit, it is going to destroy ecosystems, it's going to destroy environments, it's going to destroy people's lives, etc. So it is a destructive force ultimately, and imperialism as its latest, highest stage is bound to bear a huge antithesis to itself, which is a world revolution, in my opinion. Okay, because alongside with those other arguments, I already pointed out why this ultra monopolization and ultra imperialism is not possible. The other reason that Lenin actually mentions, as far as I remember, is that within those countries that the imperial core exploits, the working class people are going to arise as a response to the circumstances. As they see the difference, as they learn about the difference in lifestyles in their own home country and in the imperial core, as they're able to understand why their lives are not as great as they could be, and why they have to be exploited and suffer, this is when the proletarian working class movement is going to really make itself known. So that is another reason why ultra-imperialism is not possible, and that is, to me, a very good explanation as to why Kautsky was wrong. So I do recommend you read this book. It is a very short read. There are some parts that are a little bit boring because they just show you some statistical data, but Lenin was using bourgeois scientists and researchers, by the way, because he had this available. There was not much else available at the time, but you can still see even his contemporary bourgeois researchers that were able to still see the same trends, but the conclusions they made usually were kind of lukewarm. And he cites a lot of these conclusions in this work as well. So you need to get to know this work, because it's very, very helpful in understanding the modern day and age, because we live in this late stage imperialist times. And one more reason why I think people need to read it is because there is this huge myth about technofeudalism, and this is when people also believe basically in a very similar narrative as what Kautsky was proposing, that one huge business, one huge entity is going to take over the entire world. There will be a world government, and everyone's going to be a slave to this one world government. So Lenin opposes that with very good arguments, which I kind of haphazardly try to retell, adding some more of my own thoughts and opinions. So as usual, take it with a grain of salt, but do read this book. Let me know what you think. I hope you have a great day today. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Do take care of yourself and your community first. Subscribe to me on all the social medias, even though I don't do much there, and I'll talk to you sometime later.